Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. Very glad to be joined today by a new author, for us at least, author of many other books, Greg Garrett, who is a professor at Baylor University. He also holds a very cool sounding title as canon theologian of the American Cathedral in Paris. I actually had the opportunity to see him in action there. He's written many books. I was amazed by the range on music and on film, on history, on literature, and as well as several novels. But his new book with Orbis is called The Gospel According to James Baldwin, with a subtitle that kind of really tells you what the book is about. What America's Great Prophet Can Teach Us About Life, Love, and Identity. I don't know how many of those lessons we'll get to cover today, but welcome, Greg, and tell us a little bit about what drew you to this subject, drew you to the extent that you travel all over the world in the footsteps of James Baldwin, and why you felt that these were lessons that you wanted to explore and share with us now.
Oh, Robert. Well, first, thank you so much for this beautiful book that we have done together. I'm so excited about being able to tell people about it and for the opportunity for the two of us to talk today. I had been teaching Baldwin for about 20 years, but then for the last 10 years or so, for whatever reason, he had taken kind of a hold of my heart and my mind. Whenever I was wrestling with a big issue, I discovered that Baldwin had something to say about that issue that could help me understand my own life or the world a little bit better. And as I continued to lean more deeply into the work of racial reconciliation, which is one of the primary theological things that I'm interested in, person after person echoed back at me that love of James Baldwin, that idea of Baldwin as a prophet who could teach us about the very best of us. And so for the last 10 years or so, as I point out in the book, there has never been a moment when there has not been a Baldwin book traveling with me. But a few years ago, some folks known to us in the publishing industry said, I think you should write a book about James Baldwin. I think you should write about the wisdom of James Baldwin. And early on in my nonfiction career, I had actually written several books with either a title or subtitle of The Gospel According to. Because in the publishing industry, as you remember, there was a stretch where people were beginning to make connections between the spiritual life and the life of literature or pop culture or something like that. And so, I had written books about U2 and about Hollywood film and about superhero narratives and the kind of spiritual and philosophical lessons we could learn from that. And it was suggested to me that I might want to return to my roots. As Baldwin would say, do your first things over again and write a wisdom book about what it is that Baldwin has to teach all of us. And I was very excited about that because I feel like I have learned so much from him about all of the things that I write about in the book, about race, about identity, about justice, about faith, about art. Because those are all areas where he wrote and spoke and sort of manifested some kind of witness. And so this has been a long sort of 6-year journey as I thought about the book and put together proposals for it. And in the publishing industry, sometimes things happen. You have a great idea and somebody else has a great idea. So Eddie Glaude from Princeton wrote a terrific book about James Baldwin that came out a couple of years ago. And so there was a stretch where nobody else seemed to want to read a book about James Baldwin. And so a couple of years on, then it became a little bit more possible. And also as people saw sort of the difference between Professor Glaude's book and my book, that this was what I like to think of as a wisdom book, not so attuned to the political moment, but sort of eternal in the sense that, as I point out in the book, there are a string of Baldwin moments, and he is always there to teach us something. So that's the primary reason why I wanted to write this book and why I wanted to follow him all over the globe, including, as the book points out, to a place high in the Swiss Alps, where a person like myself with an abject fear of heights has to just really want to be present in order for that to happen. But working on this book and thinking about Baldwin and talking about Baldwin with people who have been strongly affected by him as well. This has been an amazing 6 years. In the last couple of years, when I was actively involved in travel and research and writing, this is one of my favorite book projects that I've ever done.
The next year is actually going to be the centenary of Baldwin's birth, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct.
But as you say, it has felt the last few years that we've been going through not a Baldwin moment, but a reckoning with Baldwin as somebody who really does speak to our culture and maybe the crisis of American democracy and the racial crisis in our country, reckoning with our identity as Americans.
Yes.
What are some of the things in Baldwin that make him such an apt kind of mirror or prophet for our time?
Well, I think first, one of the big things is that he was willing to take on the task of being a witness, to talk not only about the truth that he experienced, but that the truth that he was seeing wherever he was around the world. And, he grew up in Harlem, where he was witness personally to, a mountain of injustices. But he also experienced in Paris a sort of set of racial difficulties, even though people in France like to think that there's no racism. And he would travel to the American South, not because it was a place where he felt safe, he felt endangered and terrified, but also because he felt like there were incredible things happening in the American South in terms of race and justice that he needed to report on, to be a witness to. I think one of the things would be that Baldwin was willing to tell the truth. But a second thing was that he was willing to recognize the humanity of everybody on every side of that issue. So one of the works that I talk about in this book that is not actually particularly well known is a play by Baldwin called Blues for Mr. Charlie. It's a play that he wrote. It appeared on Broadway. I think it's a really fine play. But in his published notes to the play, and also in his own personal notes, he talks about how this play, which is based on the murder of Emmett Till, which is absolutely in the news, as you and I talked today, President Biden is dedicating a national monument to Emmett Till and to his mother. But Baldwin said, even though it's very clear that there is a white villain to this play, the murderer of a young black man from the North, it's necessary for us to understand who he is and where he comes from and why he does what he does. And so part of what I think makes Baldwin so important as somebody writing about race and justice is his life as a critic and his life as a teller of stories. One of the things that I know from my life as a novelist is that every character that I write about is broken. And some people respond to those places of brokenness in ways that are healthier than others. Baldwin had both this awareness of the injustice that he spoke out about and a sympathy and a love for the people committing that injustice. And so at the same time that, he was taken to task for not wanting to lean in the direction of the Nation of Islam and to take up arms or to, drive white people into the ocean. At the end of the day, I find him much closer to Martin Luther King in his teaching about the primacy of love. It doesn't take away the violence. It doesn't take away any of the injustice, but there's an incredible amount of hope in Baldwin, even after all that he's witnessed, which for me is incredibly inspiring.
James Cone, in his final book, which is a memoir, devotes a chapter to Baldwin. and talks about how Baldwin, in a way, for him was a kind of integration both of the theme of love in Martin Luther King and blackness in Malcolm X. He felt
Yes.
that Baldwin for him was the person who channeled both of those and inspired him very much.
See, that is a lovely connection. And one of the unfinished works that Baldwin left, which became the movie I'm Not Your Negro, was that Baldwin wanted to go back and revisit the work of some of the great civil rights era figures that he had known and loved, Medgar Evans, Malcolm, Martin, and to talk about what he had learned from them and sort of assimilated from them. And so that James Cone reference, I think, is really a good way to think about how Baldwin brings together a lot of the important ideas and attitudes of that period. But he also continues to speak to us because, I mean, as we are well aware, we are not a post-racial society. We are, 3 steps back from where we were 10 years ago in terms of where we are in race and justice issues. And I mean, it's interesting that Baldwin speaks, I think, as loudly into the age of Trump as he did into the age of Kennedy. Those teachings continue to resonate. And, thinking about the 100th anniversary, the centennial of Baldwin next year, it's remarkable to think about because in some ways, as I point out in the book, it's strange to realize that we've only had a James Baldwin for 100 years. It feels like to me that he's a piece of his voice has been eternally speaking, and that's a great hope for me that it will go on speaking as we reckon with this age and the one after this.
I find myself very fascinated by the way Baldwin explores the kind of psychology of racism and how it functions as a way not just of holding some people down, but for white people to find their own identity and sense of worth and value through their superiority or through their idea of being normative or defining the culture. I think of how that connects in particular about some of the ways that now there's this attack on so-called critical race theory, teaching about racism or civil rights history or slavery in schools, because that might make white children feel uncomfortable. And so therefore that is racist, to kind of talk about race.
It's a startling thing. And I've got 2 things. One is a Baldwin thing and one is a teaching thing. And so if I get carried away on the Baldwin thing, remind me that I just parked the teaching thing over here. Baldwin was very aware that race is a construct and that it's a construct created by people who look like you and me in order to create a system or a hierarchy that establishes people who look and act and live like you and me at the top of that ladder, whatever that looks like. I'm actually here at this cabin in Colorado, 5 years into an ongoing work on racist mythologies for Oxford University Press. And I pushed some of that research into our book because it was very clear to me that Baldwin understood that whiteness is a thing that white people made up, and that blackness is also a thing that white people made up, and that white people define themselves in opposition to that blackness, which is actually cutting edge in terms of the scholarly research about race that's happened over the last 20 or 30 years. I'm sure Baldwin would love to hear that, that he was, even though he was a high school graduate and never went to college, that when scholars today think about whiteness, think about race, think about caste, Isabel Wilkerson's amazing book, that Baldwin actually had said all of this stuff, and often before any of them said it. So that idea that race is a construct to create hierarchies is something that he wrote about. And I mean, most beautifully, I think, in his letter to his nephew, which is the opening letter in Fire Next Time. And I'll just throw this out here. I think in that paperback edition, it's 7 pages. I would hold those 7 pages of writing against every 7, like any 7 pages from any American writer. I don't know of any greater section of writing that's ever been done by an American. But the second thing is that we think about all of the controversy about CRT. As we are speaking today, Florida has recently passed a set of educational standards in which students will be taught that slaves learned useful skills in the process of, you know, being raped and murdered and maimed and worked to death. And I have been teaching Baldwin for a long time to white students, and Baylor is very diverse. So, you know, there are people of color, there are LGBTQ people, people who have more of a direct identity connection with Baldwin. But I taught the Fire Next Time in a general education class at Baylor this spring. And what I discovered is what I have discovered teaching works by King and by Malcolm X and by Ernest Gaines and by Toni Morrison. White students are challenged by them, but they're also inspired and enlarged by them. I mean, you and I know this. We had educational experiences that shifted us and shaped us and changed who we were. And Baldwin did his work again this spring. He said things that made people uncomfortable, which in Florida and in my native Texas, there's legislation around how that shouldn't be taught to people in public schools. But what he did during his time speaking, teaching, and writing, and what he's doing now, is that he makes people uncomfortable, but that discomfort is the place where learning and change can happen. And that's why I love teaching him and why I love reading him. Because, you know, every time I read him, he shifts me a couple of meters away from where I've been.
In that letter to his nephew, he stresses a theme that runs through a lot of his writing about not falling into the trap of believing you are that category that has been defined for you, your place, that you're a human being, you're not this label, you're not this projection of inferiority or subordination that has been defined for you.
That is one of the reasons that I wanted to close our book with a chapter on identity. And all of the different pieces of the book are interrelated because, you know, when you and I walk through the world, we believe things, but they're often connected to each other. So, you know, what I think about justice is connected to what I think about faith. You know, how I manifest my Christian faith shows up in like how I think about race and justice, for example. But the last chapter in our book about identity goes back to that thing that he said to his nephew, and he was remembering the cruel and squalid life of his stepfather, who believed the things that white people had said about him. And he said, you know, please know that you don't ever have to do that. And then the book and film, I Am Not Your Negro. And actually in the broadcast video that the title comes from, Baldwin used the N word. But he said, I am not that.
Yeah, right.
And if you need me to be that, it's not about me. It's about you.
Yeah.
And so that rejection of categories and that rejection of stereotypes, bad mythologies, if you will, was a part of the broader teaching that he did about what it means to be human. So toward the end of his life, he was working on a play called The Welcome Table. It was set in the south of France where he lived, where Josephine Baker lived. And he was thinking about, particularly about dinner time at Josephine Baker's house, where there would be this rainbow collection of people of all sorts and all kinds. And what I understand about Baldwin and what he was thinking about throughout his life and what he was working toward at the end of his life was this idea that someday in the New Jerusalem, if that's what it takes, we will get to this place where we're not judged by the color of our skins or by who we love or by where we come from or by how much money we have or by who we worship or don't worship. In one of the late interviews in his life, he said, someday there will just be us. And he said that about his characters as well. You don't think about the characters you write as a category. They're just human beings. And so what I love about that last chapter on identity was that it sort of allowed us to lean into one of my great hopes, that welcome table idea that he was working on his last play, also drawn from the Great Black Spiritual. I'm going to meet at the welcome table with all of these people one of these days. And there will be nothing but love. There will be no judgment. We'll be seen and recognized. And, whatever distinctions, surface distinctions people think they are will simply not matter.
That's a good place to move backwards a little bit and talk about the chapter on faith and Baldwin's complicated relationship with Christianity. He was very steeped in that in his youth. He was raised to be a preacher in Pentecostal church. He'd left that behind very definitely. And yet it was still always in his bones. And he carried on this ongoing dialogue or conversation with Christianity, which he's found strengths and also great hypocrisy and distortions. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. One of the things that I think I've done in this book is that I have tried to understand where Baldwin was in terms of his own faith. And, the public pronouncements that he made were pretty vocal. So, for example, a reviewer at the Christian Century emailed me this week and said, we're going to review the book. We're very excited about it. I have this question, because Baldwin spoke to the World Council of Churches, and like his opening words to them were, I am not a theologian. And he said, how do you reconcile that? And I said, what it makes me think about is that this is his reassertion of his independence from the Christian church that he understood. As he gets ready to tell the Christian church some things that they may not want to hear. So in that chapter on faith, I leaned very heavy into the idea of theology. People typically think about theologians. So like you were referring to my job as canon theologian for the American Cathedral in Paris, which is a sweet gig, I will admit. But whenever I tell people about that, they're like, what does that mean? And theology, as we know, is talk about God. So who or what is God? Who are we supposed to be? What does it mean to live in a faithful community? What does a faithful life look like? What is justice? All of the things that Baldwin cared about and wrote about in his fiction, his nonfiction, his criticism are theological in that sense. And so there's this very powerful idea that, as I mentioned in the book, sort of quoting Paul Thomas Anderson, the past may be through with us. We may be through with the past, but the past is not through with us. And I know that you and I probably have known plenty of people raised Roman Catholic or Jewish or Southern Baptist who are like, I'm not that. And yet, I can still sing all 7 verses of Just As I Am. So the other thing that I would say about Baldwin is that the research that I got to do for this book took me behind the scenes into his spiritual life in ways that biographies and criticism don't always get. I was able to look at letters, I was able to look at manuscripts, and at the same time as I'm looking at the things that he's written and the speeches and interviews, one of the things that was most powerful to me was taking a look at letters that he had written to his then agent and literary manager, Robert Mills, whose letters are actually at the Ransom Center in Austin, where I live. And it was remarkable to me how in letter after letter, Baldwin would share the difficulties and heartbreaks that he was going through and ask Bob Mills to pray for him. Just the behind the scenes belief that takes place. And the other thing that I mentioned in the book is that just before the March on Washington, in 1963, Baldwin went to the American Church in Paris, which is on the other side of the river from me. It's the Protestants, and it's actually also a sweet church. And he went there and he spoke to them, and he felt like this was the appropriate place to put together a march on the American embassy in Paris that would preview and parallel the March on Washington. One of my favorite pictures of Baldwin is him standing at a podium in the American church. And it's like, this is 20 years after he left, 30 years after he left the formal church. He's preaching.
Yeah.
And as he said in his own writing and his own speaking, I probably never stopped being a preacher.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the title of your book, The Gospel, according to James Baldwin, might make people think that this is going to be Baldwin's reflections on the gospel or on Jesus. But there's this sort of his own kind of implicit gospel message. I mean, as a kind of prophet, he has this deep sense of a absolute kind of love, absolute truth, absolute justice, by which he examines or surveys or bears witness to the reality around him. And it certainly draws on biblical motifs, and his famous book, The Fire Next Time, coming from the spirituals, and the language of the prophets. But it's almost his own kind of religion, you could say. That and to the extent that that doesn't always coincide with Christianity. Well, maybe too bad for Christianity then.
That actually is my strong feeling. One of the things that I wanted to do in writing this book was to talk about what the church could learn from Baldwin.
Yeah.
And I think there's that very powerful sense of the things that you have leaned into. And particularly now in America, where white Christian nationalism has unbalanced the way that people think about what religion is supposed to be. I mean, he is a powerful and profound voice speaking against that kind of division and against any kind of religion that creates hatred instead of love.
James Cone, also in that chapter that I referenced, there was a striking thing as you're talking about, kind of theological, reflection. What does that mean? And he talks about a passage in The Fire Next Time where Baldwin is talking about the incredible suffering that Black people have experienced. And yet he says, and yet there's a beauty in that. And a lot of students react and say, what are you talking about? How can there be beauty and suffering and all this kind of thing? And without referencing the cross exactly, Cone says he's speaking in theological language, not sociological or not aesthetic or something like that. Only a theological language that allows you to see beauty that can come out of terrible suffering. Whether it's the resilience, it's the culture, it's the Black love, it's the spirituals, it's jazz, it's the blues, it's a kind of a capacity to survive and to prevail over circumstances that are denying your worth and your identity.
Yeah. And the resilience and the strength and the beauty of Black people in America is one of the things that comes out over and over again in Baldwin's work. One of the things that I like to think about, our book is bookended by my two trips to Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
And when Baldwin went to Switzerland, he told Studs Terkel in a big, important early interview that before he could write his first novel and sort of successfully bring that back to the publisher, go tell it on the mountain, he had to recapture his voice, and he had to recapture his sense that the Black experience was profound and beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And so he talked about listening to Bessie Smith's records in that chalet in Switzerland. So listening to the blues and listening to the redemptive power of the blues. I am lost. I don't know what's going to happen. My life is falling apart. And yet I can witness to that with beauty and with rhythm. Mm-hmm. And he said, listening to those Bessie Smith records allowed him to recapture the voice of Harlem, mm-hmm. and to recapture that experience as one that was powerful and beautiful and redemptive. And it puts me in mind of what Dr. King said about how unmerited suffering is always redemptive. And I want to believe that. It feels like a whole lot of suffering just looks like chaos. But I do lean into what James Cone said, and I lean into that idea in Baldwin as well, that what we have gone through, the strength and the beauty and the power of what we have experienced and lived through and risen above. Mm-hmm. And again, none of that makes it worthwhile. It's still awful. It still deserves to be repented of by people who look like me. But it's a powerful experience, whether it's story or theology or however we want to talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's that again, a central kind of gospel message that of the cross, that death, suffering does not have the last word, that there's a force more powerful. I keep quoting James Cone, but he there was a line I'd love to, as we kind of close up, see what you think of this. He says, people who read Baldwin become better human beings. What do you think of that?
I believe that is absolutely true. I mean, that's the whole reason I wrote this book. And, I was rereading the book in preparation for our interview. This is my first interview on the book. There are going to be a whole lot more. So. None of them are going to be as friendly as this, probably. But as I was looking at that last chapter, there was this very powerful sense, as I reflected on the journey that I've gone on with Baldwin, that I am a different person, but I'm also my very best self, because I've been exposed to the things that Baldwin said. My graduate student, Daniel Smith, who's quoted a couple of times in our book, says that what readers of Baldwin need to allow him to do is rattle the foundations of their own ruins. Mm-hmm. And he is such a beautiful writer that I tried to quote him every chance that I could. Because basically what Baldwin does, particularly for people who look like me, is to say, all of these things are true, and all of us can do better. But when I was teaching Baldwin this spring, I am still leaning into and thinking about this experience that I had. One of my students in that class was a Baylor football player. He's in the defensive backfield. He's a safety. His job is to run across the field and just knock the crap out of people. He is not what you would think of as a great reader, but he was tenacious. He read Faulkner. But when he read Baldwin, he pulled me aside one day in the hallway and he said, there has never been a time in my life where I felt seen like this. Mm-hmm. And so I think the thing that Baldwin can do is that he can allow people who share some portion of his identity to be seen and heard in ways that are powerful and profound. And he can also challenge people like us to do better, to live more fully into that work of reconciliation and justice that he calls for in his witness. And that's the amazing thing about this. What I hope our book will do for people is introduce or reintroduce them to Baldwin as this powerful speaker of wisdom that never goes out of style.
Well, thank you. I like to think that not just reading Baldwin makes you a better person, but maybe reading a book about Baldwin will make you a better human being. At least it's a good place to start. And you could not do better than start with this wonderful book by Greg Garrett, The Gospel According to James Baldwin. Thank you very much for joining us and for writing this book.